It's uncommon for passengers to cause maritime disasters, which is why the sinking of the Ramdas in 1947 stands out as a peculiar reminder of how human behavior can be more dangerous than open waters. More peculiar still was how people discovered that the ship had failed to make its voyage. But, as always, to know how this boat and its passengers succumbed to the waves, we need to first understand what the Ramdas is. Back in the 1940s, passenger ferries in India tended to be twin-screw. A twin-screw is a type of steam-powered watercraft that uses two propellers to cancel our propeller walk. In short, propeller walk is how the use of the spinning blades can produce a knockback from the water, which causes the hull to drift slightly to one side. All this to say that the Ramdas ship was built for sturdy traverses across the Arabian Sea, and at 46 tons and 10 years old, this ship was primed to cut through the water with no problem. And it wouldn't have been the first time that this ferry had been selected to travel from Bombay, now Mumbai, to Ruas, one of the minor ports in the western Indian peninsula of Maharashtra. In fact, it made this journey almost daily. The route is a mere 32.4 nautical miles around a few small islands and the jagged Indian coastline. Of all the parts of the western India which open up from the Arabian Sea, the Karanya Creek is the widest, which means that once the ferry nears this last leg of the journey, it will become more susceptible to the influence of the wider ocean. And the wider ocean naturally has higher winds, owing to the higher temperatures from the Indian subcontinent. This means that choppy waves can be expected, yet can still be surprising, such as when a sudden gust of wind alters the shape of the water at a moment's notice. It's the morning of July 17, 1947, and fishermen in the Bombay harbor witness something straight out of a horror movie. Corpses floating inland, with a few exhausted survivors amongst the dead. It was now that people first heard eyewitness testimony of how, just an hour ago, the Ramdas ferry had capsized, taking 700 of her passengers with it. Initially, the ferrying had been fine. Then, just 30 minutes after leaving Bombay, and just off a protrusion of rocks near Gull Island, a minuscule landmass not far from the boat's final destination, disaster struck. The boat entered a monsoon storm, typical of this time of year in this part of the globe. Suddenly, the water became rough. But when a huge wave caught the boat's starboard side, it surprised the passengers who ran to the port side. The panic from the sudden hit of water turned out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the radical change in weight distribution caused the boat to turn over. Of the over 700 people on board, 690 died, making it one of the worst shipwrecks in the Mumbai harbor, with locals dubbing it Mumbai's Titanic. Assuming you had not been dragged to the seabed with the vacuum pull of a sinking ship, your next obstacle would be the crowds of people in the water. Some would have perished by crushing, unable to resurface for air as too many people were on the water's surface. As would be expected with panicked crowds, a flurry of arms and legs from panicked people grabbing onto each other would weigh passengers down, as if dogpiled, and push them under. Panic is a significant course of drowning, which is why lifeguards are trained to drag people from the back of the head in a neck hold, to deter them from fighting. This deterrence forces them to acquiesce and help preserve energy. But the moments immediately after falling into the water would have created an every-man-for-himself mentality, a logical progression for the survivalist instinct that induced panic when the wave struck. Panic had caused the capsizing, and now it was picking off the survivors. So even if you were lucky enough, or unlucky enough, depending on your perspective, to get this far, you then had to swim to safety. But this wasn't going to be a few laps in the pool. You're looking at least a dozen or so kilometers in a monsoon before even getting close to fishing boats. This inevitably means some survivors of the initial panic would soon fall victim to their own bodies when they ran out of energy. And while this is happening, while you are fighting for survival against the seemingly endless waves, the disaster fresh in your head, you can see dead bodies bobbing in the ocean, perhaps even of your own friends and family. The tragedy had struck on Gattari Amavasya, the celebration of the new moon, before the beginning of Shravan, an event to make the arrival of monsoons typically celebrating with fasting. This makes it incredibly likely that the passengers had been celebrating the night before with food and drink and dancing, and were now returning home to be with their awaiting families. This increases the possibility that the daily ferry had so many people that day due to festivities. But perhaps this was only prolonging the inevitable, as sooner or later would have this many on board on choppy waters. It was an accident waiting to happen. And happen it did. A rescue operation was mounted by the fishermen of Ruas. Not many survivors were left over, though the selfless and brave men were still rewarded for their efforts by the Indian government, who allotted them land and a jetty. Then, 4 years later, the Bombay Port Trust decided to salvage the boat in August of 1951, but the wreck would resurface on its own at Ballard Pier, way back at its departure point. Yet another mystery where the ship itself somehow survives. Nowadays, the locals of Mumbai have adopted the boat into their lore. A popular Marathi folk song narrates the events of that fateful day in oddly lively rhythm and simple lyrics. No doubt an effective way to imprint the tragedy in the memory of the local people. It's hard to think that were it not for those handful of survivors, the disaster would have remained a mystery forever. One of the survivors was the boat's captain, whose personal testimony helped piece together what had happened. Now, years later, an 89-year-old survivor has shed more light on what he saw as a 10-year-old boy aboard the Ramdas all those years ago. Speaking to a film research crew, he recalls seeing a teacher hopping onto the ship at the last moment. He remembers seeing tourists from Goa and even an English couple sitting on the upper deck with their 9-year-old daughter. He himself was traveling alone with vegetables to sell, unaware that a select few of those around him would be swimming along him to safety in less than an hour. No one knows which passenger ran portside first. No one knows the moment a tipping point was reached, and the eyewitness testimony we have of that chaotic turn of events is scant and foggy. Perhaps it's for the best that the details are blurry, as a high-resolution understanding of what it must have been like would be too much to bear. The exact understanding would be too gruesome. Would it really be respectful of the victims' memories to know if they had been pinned by the capsizing ship or dragged underwater by panicking co-passengers? This disaster should not be remembered for the hard mentality which brought it down, but for the collective good of preserving the memories of those nameless victims in song and dance. How can we blame the passengers if we can't calculate every individual's contribution? There are too many details and yet too little clarity. And what's more, it was inevitable. It could have been another ferry, another year, a different celebration, so in the end, it was a roll of the dice. At least the people of Mumbai and the family and friends of those poor victims take solace that though there are many answers which are unknown, the sinking of the Ramdas will not be forgotten. The passengers may have caused their own deaths, but generations of generations keep their memory alive. But what do you think? Is anyone responsible, or was it bad luck? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Please share this with anyone who is interested in folklore and history, and leave a like if you want to uncover more stories. As always, don't forget to subscribe to get the latest video covering maritime tragedies and forgotten human history.